The crimson sun of June 3, 1942 cast long shadows across the flight deck of the Akagi as Admiral Kiichi Nagamo stared at the endless Pacific horizon. In less than 24 hours, the most audacious naval gamble in Japanese history would either secure their empire's dominance or seal its doom. The man who had orchestrated the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier now carried the weight of Japan's entire Pacific strategy on his shoulders. Unaware that American codebreakers had already unraveled his carefully laid plans, the Battle of Midway was conceived not merely as another tactical victory, but as the decisive stroke that would eliminate the United States Navy as a Pacific power. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Japan's naval supremacy, had convinced the Imperial High Command that capturing Midway Atoll would force the remaining American fleet into a final, catastrophic engagement. The Americans, he argued, would have no choice but to defend this strategic outpost lying just over 1,000 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor. What Yamamoto couldn't have known was that his encrypted communications had been compromised for months, and Admiral Chester Nimitz was already positioning his forces for an ambush. The Japanese armada approaching Midway represented the pinnacle of naval aviation power. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu carried over 270 aircraft, supported by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers in a force that had dominated every engagement since the war began. The carrier pilots, veterans of Pearl Harbor, the Dutch East Indies, and the Indian Ocean raids, possessed an almost mystical confidence in their invincibility. They had sunk more Allied tonnage in 6 months than many admirals saw in entire careers. Commander Mitsuo Fukita, who had led the first wave against Pearl Harbor, stood among his pilots as they received their final briefings. The target was clear: obliterate Midway's defenses, seize the atoll, and crush the American fleet when it inevitably sailed to its rescue. Intelligence reports suggested minimal American presence, perhaps 1 or 2 carriers at most. The Japanese had every reason to believe they were sailing toward another triumphant slaughter. As referenced in declassified Imperial Navy documents from the National Archives, yet beneath the surface confidence, subtle signs of overextension plagued the Japanese fleet. The rapid pace of conquest had stretched maintenance schedules thin, and several aircraft showed signs of mechanical stress. More critically, the complex battle plan divided Japanese forces across multiple objectives, with simultaneous operations planned against the Aleutian Islands to confuse American intelligence. This division of strength, while appearing strategically sound, would prove fatal when facing an enemy who knew exactly where and when to strike. As dawn approached on June 4th, the Japanese carriers turned into the wind to launch their first strike against Midway. The flight decks buzzed with activity as mechanics made final checks on the Kate torpedo bombers and Val dive bombers that would spearhead the assault. The Zero fighters, sleek and deadly, waited their turn to provide escort. None of the crews could have imagined that within hours, their supposedly invincible carriers would be transformed into floating infernos, and the course of the Pacific War would be irreversibly altered in favor of their enemies. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga lifted his Kate bomber from the Hiryu's deck as the first rays of sunlight pierced the morning haze on June 4th, 1942. Behind him, 107 aircraft formed up in perfect formations, 36 Kate horizontal bombers, 36 Val dive bombers, and 36 Zero fighters. Their mission was straightforward: reduce Midway's defenses to rubble and prepare the way for invasion. What they discovered over the tiny atoll would trigger a chain of decisions that would doom the Imperial Japanese Navy. The American defenders of Midway had been expecting this attack for days. Thanks to the brilliant work of Station Hypo, the Navy's cryptographic unit in Hawaii, Admiral Nimitz knew not only that the Japanese were coming, but when and in what strength. The small garrison on Midway, barely 3,000 Marines and Navy personnel, had been reinforced with every available aircraft, from obsolete booster Buffalo fighters to flying Fortress heavy bombers. As the Japanese formation approached, radar operators tracked their every move, and the island's defenders scrambled to meet them. The aerial battle over Midway erupted with savage intensity as Marine pilots in their outclassed Buffaloes threw themselves against the veteran Japanese. Formation. Major Floyd Parks led Marine Fighter Squadron 221 in a desperate charge against the approaching bombers. Knowing full well that his aircraft were no match for the nimble Zeros, the sky filled with tracers, smoke, and falling aircraft, as the Americans fought with suicidal courage to protect their base. Parks himself was shot down and killed, but his sacrifice and that of his pilots bought precious time for Midway's defenses. Tomonaga pressed his attack through the American interceptors, leading his bombers over the atoll's installations. The small island erupted in explosions as Japanese bombs tore apart hangars, fuel dumps, and defensive positions. Yet as the smoke cleared, Tomonaga could see that Midway's critical infrastructure remained largely intact. The airstrips were damaged, but still operational, and anti-aircraft fire continued to rise from multiple positions. Most importantly, he noted the absence of American aircraft on the ground, a clear sign that they had been warned and dispersed. As the Japanese strike force turned for home, Tomonaga made the fateful radio call that would seal his fleet's doom. "There is need for a second attack wave," he transmitted to Admiral Nagamo aboard the Akagi. The message reached the flagship just as the admiral faced an agonizing decision. His aircraft carriers still held a second wave of planes, but these were armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for attacking ships. American fleet that intelligence promised would appear. Should he rearm them with high-explosive bombs for another land attack, or maintain them ready for naval combat? Unknown. To Nagamo, American search planes had already spotted his fleet. At 6:25 that morning, Ensign Jack Reed, flying a Catalina patrol bomber, had radioed the electrifying message. Enemy carriers bearing 320 degrees, distance 180 miles. The information raced through American communication channels, reaching Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard the Enterprise and Admiral Frank Fletcher on the Yorktown. The trap was about to be sprung, as documented in official Navy combat reports housed at the Naval History and Heritage Command. As Tomonaga's battered strike force limped back toward their carriers, many aircraft trailing smoke and several pilots wounded, the stage was set for one of history's most consequential naval battles. The Japanese had achieved tactical success over Midway, but at the cost of revealing their position and strength to an enemy that was already moving to attack. Admiral Nagamo, still unaware of the American fleet's proximity, ordered his second wave rearmed for another assault on Midway's installations. The decision would prove catastrophic, leaving his most powerful warships vulnerable at the precise moment. American dive bombers were beginning their approach through the morning sky. Admiral Kiichi Nagamo paced the bridge of the Akagi as conflicting reports flooded his flagship's communication center on the morning of June 4, 1942. The veteran commander who had led the successful Pearl Harbor attack now faced the most complex tactical situation of his career, with split-second decisions that would determine not just the battle's outcome, but the fate of the Japanese Empire. At 7:15, as his aircraft were being hastily rearmed below decks, a scout plane reported the presence of American ships to the northeast, but the pilot failed to specify whether carriers were among them. The Japanese flight decks had become scenes of controlled chaos as ordnance crews raced to swap out the armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes on the second attack wave for high-explosive bombs, suitable for land targets. Aviation fuel lines snaked across the hangar decks. Ammunition lay stacked in staging areas, and aircraft were positioned wingtip to maximize space. The carriers that had seemed invincible just hours before were now floating powder kegs, vulnerable to the slightest spark. Nagamo's staff urged him to launch immediately against the reported American ships, but without confirmation of carriers, the admiral hesitated. Meanwhile, American task forces were racing toward their date with destiny. Admiral Raylan Spruance, commanding Task Force 16 with the carriers Enterprise and Hornet, had made the bold decision to launch his aircraft at maximum range, over 170 miles from the Japanese fleet. This meant his pilots would have barely enough fuel to return, but it also meant catching the enemy at their most vulnerable moment. Admiral Frank Fletcher, with the patched-up Yorktown still bearing scars from the Coral Sea battle, followed suit despite his carrier's reduced aircraft complement, the first American. Attacks proved disastrously ineffective, serving only to convince the Japanese that their victory was assured. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet found the Japanese fleet first, their obsolete Devastator aircraft lumbering toward the carriers. At wave-top height, the squadron's commander, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, had predicted they were flying into a death trap, and his prophecy proved grimly accurate. Zero fighters swarmed the slow-moving torpedo bombers, shooting down all 15 aircraft. Only one pilot, Ensign George Gay, survived, floating in the Pacific to witness the battle's climax. 2 more torpedo squadrons met similar fates as they pressed home attacks against the maneuvering Japanese carriers. The Zeros, flying at optimal altitude and with ample ammunition, systematically destroyed the American torpedo planes, while the carrier anti-aircraft guns added to the slaughter. Of 41 torpedo bombers launched that morning, only 6 would return to their carriers. The Japanese pilots felt invincible as they watched the American aircraft fall like leaves, unaware that this very success was drawing them down to sea level at the critical moment, at 10:24, with Nagamo finally deciding to launch against the American fleet. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led 37 dive bombers from the Enterprise in a high-altitude search for the Japanese carriers. Running dangerously low on fuel and about to turn back, McCluskey spotted the wake of a Japanese destroyer racing northward to rejoin the main fleet. Following this thread, he crested a cloud bank to see the most beautiful sight in naval aviation: 4 enemy aircraft carriers spread below him, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being prepared for launch. The moment that would change history had arrived. As referenced in McCluskey's own after-action report, preserved in Navy archives, the Enterprise dive bombers began their attack runs, just as Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie brought his Yorktown squadrons into position over a second carrier group. The Japanese, their fighters at sea level, after massacring the torpedo squadrons, and their carriers caught in the vulnerable process of launching aircraft, were about to experience the terrible swift sword of American vengeance. The rising sun that had illuminated Japanese conquests from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean was about to set in flames over the Pacific. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey pushed his Douglas Dauntless into a 70-degree dive at precisely 10:22 on the morning of June 4, 1942, beginning the most decisive 5 minutes in naval aviation history. 3 miles below, the Japanese carrier Koga wallowed in the Pacific swells, her flight deck packed with aircraft, armed and fueled for the strike that would never come. McCluskey's dive bomber screamed downward at over 200 miles per hour, followed by his entire squadron in a perfectly coordinated attack that the Japanese had not anticipated and could not defend against. The first American bomb struck the Koga near her island superstructure at exactly 10:24, detonating among the closely packed aircraft and triggering a chain reaction of exploding ordnance and aviation fuel. Within seconds, the pride of the Japanese fleet was transformed into a floating inferno as secondary explosions ripped through her hangar decks. Flight petty officers and pilots who had survived Pearl Harbor, the Dutch East Indies, and dozens of Pacific battles were consumed in the hellish fires that no amount of damage control could extinguish. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Richard Best led his section of 3 dive bombers against the flagship Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's own carrier. Best's 1,000-pound bomb penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the upper hangar, where armed and fueled aircraft awaited launch. The blast wave hurled blazing aviation gasoline throughout the ship's interior, while the concussion killed dozens of aircrew in the ready rooms below. The Akagi, which had launched the Pearl Harbor attack and terrorized the Pacific for 6 months, was mortally wounded in a single devastating moment. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's Yorktown Squadron struck the carrier Soryu with equal precision, their bombs igniting the same catastrophic fires that were consuming her sister ships. The Japanese damage control parties, trained for battle damage but not for the inferno of exploding ordnance and aviation fuel, found themselves fighting a losing battle against fires that reached temperatures of over 2,000 degrees. Commander Ryuzaku Yanagimoto, the Soryu's captain, chose to go down with his ship rather than abandon the vessel that had been his home and pride. Within the span of 6 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers had been reduced to blazing wrecks that would never again threaten Allied shipping. The pilots who had dominated Pacific skies since December 7th were dead or trapped aboard dying ships, their irreplaceable experience and skill lost forever. The carefully trained aircrew that had taken years to develop were being incinerated, along with their aircraft, representing a loss that Japan's industrial capacity could never replace in time to affect the war's outcome. Admiral Nagumo, evacuated from the burning Akagi to the light cruiser Nagara, surveyed the destruction of his fleet with the stunned disbelief of a commander who had never experienced defeat. The fires consuming his carriers lit the horizon like funeral pyres for Japanese naval supremacy, as documented in Nagumo's own action report submitted to Imperial headquarters after the battle. The admiral who had once commanded the most powerful naval aviation force in history now watched helplessly as American dive bombers completed the destruction of Japan's Pacific Empire. Only the carrier Hiryu remained operational, racing north under the command of Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi with the last of Japan's Pacific carrier aircraft. The defiant admiral immediately ordered strikes against the American fleet, determined to salvage something from the disaster, even if it cost him his ship and crew. His pilots, many of them survivors from the other carriers who had been airborne during the attack, prepared for what they knew would likely be their final mission. The rising sun flag still flew from the Hiryu's mast, but the empire it represented was already dying in the flames that consumed the Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu in the blue waters of the Pacific. Admiral Taman Yamaguchi stood on the bridge of the Hiryu as his carrier raced northwest through the Pacific swells, the last operational flight deck in the Japanese fleet, and perhaps Japan's final hope of salvaging victory from the disaster unfolding around him. At 49 years old, Yamaguchi was considered one of the Imperial Navy's most aggressive commanders, a man who had argued for a more decisive follow-up attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. Now with 3 of his fleet's 4 carriers burning on the horizon behind him, he prepared to stake everything on one desperate counterstrike against the American fleet. The Hiryu's flight deck buzzed with frantic activity as mechanics prepared every available aircraft for launch. 18 Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters, all that remained of the mighty air armada that had dominated the Pacific, were hastily armed and fueled. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, a veteran of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raids, led the pathetically small strike force into the morning sky at 11:54, following the retreating American torpedo planes back to their carriers. Behind them, the Hiryu's remaining aircraft were being prepared for a second strike that would determine whether Japan's Pacific Empire lived or died. The American carriers had not escaped unscathed from their morning triumph. The Yorktown, already damaged from the Battle of the Coral Sea a month earlier, presented the most attractive target for Kobayashi's dive bombers. At 12:10, The Japanese aircraft found Admiral Fletcher's flagship and began their attack runs through a storm of anti-aircraft fire. The Yorktown's Combat Air Patrol, reduced by the morning strikes, fought desperately to intercept the incoming bombers, but several VAL aircraft broke through the defensive screen. 3 bombs struck the Yorktown in rapid succession. The explosions, tearing through her flight deck and starting fires in the ship's interior. The first bomb penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the hangar, killing or wounding dozens of sailors and starting stubborn fires among the stored aviation fuel. The second bomb struck near the island superstructure, while the third penetrated deeper into the ship's vitals, damaging engineering spaces and reducing her speed to just 6 knots. For a moment, it appeared that Japanese persistence might yet turn the tide of battle. But the American industrial machine that would ultimately doom Japan was already evident in the Pacific Fleet's damage control capabilities. The Yorktown's crew, trained in techniques developed after analyzing British experiences in the Atlantic, fought the fires with a skill and determination that amazed even veteran sailors. Within 2 hours, the carrier was making 20 knots and preparing to recover aircraft, a resurrection that would have been impossible for any other navy in 1942. The ship that Japan thought it had sunk was back in action before. The day was over. Yamaguchi's second strike, launched at 1:30 in the afternoon, found the Yorktown again and delivered 2 torpedo hits that finally stopped the determined carrier. But this success came at a terrible price. Most of the Hiryu's remaining aircraft were shot down by the reinforced American Combat Air Patrol, and the cream of Japan's naval aviation was being systematically destroyed. As referenced in action, reports from the Battle of Midway preserved at the Naval War College, the Japanese had lost not just ships, but the irreplaceable human expertise that had made their early victories possible. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Admiral Yamaguchi faced the inevitable reality that his desperate gamble had failed. The Hiryu remained the sole operational Japanese carrier, surrounded by American task forces and with virtually no aircraft left to defend herself. The admiral who had once dreamed of dictating peace terms in the White House now prepared for the final act of the drama that would end Japan's brief moment as master of the Pacific. The empire that had awakened a sleeping giant was about to learn the full cost of its December 7th gamble. Captain Richard Fleming pushed his Douglas Dauntless into a near-vertical dive toward the Hiryu at 500 feet above the Pacific, so low that Japanese sailors could see his face through the aircraft's canopy as he pressed home, the attack that would complete Japan's naval catastrophe. The time was 5:03 in the evening of June 4th, 1942, and Fleming was leading the strike that would eliminate the last operational Japanese carrier and seal the fate of Admiral Tamon. Yamaguchi's desperate rear guard action. The Hiryu had been located by American search planes at 2:45 that afternoon, steaming northwest in a futile attempt to escape the converging American task forces. Admiral Raymond Spruance, now commanding the American pursuit after Admiral Fletcher's withdrawal aboard the damaged Yorktown, ordered every available aircraft launched against the fleeing carrier. 24 dive bombers from the Enterprise, supported by fighters from both remaining American carriers, raced across the Pacific to deliver the coup de grace to Japan's last floating airfield. Yamaguchi's crew fought their ship with the desperate courage of men who knew they were Japan's last hope in the Central Pacific. The Hiryu twisted and turned through the ocean swells, her anti-aircraft guns filling the sky with deadly bursts of flak, while her remaining Zero fighters clawed for altitude to meet the incoming Americans. The carrier that had launched the Pearl Harbor attack and terrorized Allied shipping across the Pacific now fought for her life against overwhelming odds, her crew determined to make the Americans pay dearly for their victory. The first American bomb struck the Hiryu's flight deck at 5:03, penetrating into the hangar spaces where the carrier's remaining aircraft were being prepared for one final, desperate strike. The explosions triggered the same catastrophic chain reaction that had destroyed her sister ships that morning. Aviation fuel ignited in vast sheets of flame while ordnance cooked off in thunderous secondary explosions. Within minutes, the last of Japan's Pacific carriers was ablaze from bow to stern. Her flight deck twisted and buckled beyond any hope of repair. Admiral Yamaguchi, recognizing that his ship was doomed, made the decision that would write his name in the annals of naval history. Rather than abandon the Hiryu, he chose to remain aboard and share the fate of his crew, sending a final message to Admiral Yamamoto. "Our planes are all gone. We are preparing to ram an enemy carrier." The admiral, who had argued for a more aggressive prosecution of the Pacific War, would die as he had lived, defiant in the face of impossible odds and loyal to the code that had shaped Japan's warrior class for centuries. The Hiryu continued burning through the night, her fires visible for miles as American ships maintained a respectful distance from the dying carrier. At 9:23 on the morning of June 5th, the ship that had once terrorized the Pacific finally slipped beneath the waves, taking Admiral Yamaguchi and over 400 of his crew to their deaths. As documented in survivor accounts collected by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, the admiral was last seen standing on his bridge, sword in hand, as the fires consumed his command. With the Hiryu's destruction, Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific was broken beyond repair. 4 fleet carriers, over 250 aircraft, and thousands of irreplaceable aircrew lay at the bottom of the Pacific, representing an investment in naval aviation that Japan could never hope to replace before American industrial might overwhelmed the empire completely. Admiral Chester Nimitz, reviewing the battle reports at his Pearl Harbor headquarters, understood that June 4, 1942, would be remembered as the day American naval power achieved decisive superiority in the Pacific. The rising sun that had seemed so triumphant 6 months earlier was setting forever beneath the waves of Midway, and with it died Japan's dream of Pacific domination. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood alone on the bridge of his flagship, Yamato, as the first reports of the Midway disaster reached him through the crackling radio transmissions of June 5, 1942. The architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who had warned his government that they had awakened the sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve, now confronted the catastrophic vindication of his own prophecy. 4 fleet carriers destroyed, over 3,000 sailors dead, and Japan's offensive naval capability eliminated in a single day. The empire that had seemed invincible 6 months earlier was now fighting for its very survival. The immediate aftermath of Midway revealed the true scope of Japan's loss in terms that went far beyond ships and aircraft. The veteran aircrew who had perished represented years of intensive training that could never be replaced in time to affect the war's outcome. Flight petty officers with thousands of hours of combat experience, squadron commanders who had perfected tactics through months of successful operations, and pilots who had sunk millions of tons of Allied shipping were gone forever. Japan's naval aviation, built painstakingly over 2 decades, had been destroyed in 6 hours of American dive bombing. Emperor Hirohito, briefed on the disaster in the secure chambers of the imperial palace, grasped immediately that his empire's strategic situation had been fundamentally altered. The offensive operations that had carried Japanese forces from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean were now impossible to sustain, and the initiative in the Pacific had passed irreversibly to the Americans. The divine wind that was supposed to protect Japan had failed at the moment of greatest need, leaving the home islands vulnerable to the counteroffensive that would surely follow. Admiral Nimitz, analyzing the battle results from his Pearl Harbor command center, understood that Midway represented far more than a tactical victory. It was the strategic turning point that would enable the systematic destruction of Japanese power throughout the Pacific. The American industrial capacity that Japan had hoped to neutralize with a quick, Decisive victory was now fully mobilized and producing warships, aircraft, and trained personnel at rates that dwarfed Japanese capabilities. The sleeping giant was not just awake, but angry and armed with the tools of modern warfare. The human cost of Japan's gamble became evident in the months following Midway, as families throughout the empire received notification that their sons would not be returning from the Pacific. The carefully maintained fiction of Japanese invincibility crumbled as news of the defeat spread through military channels, and the home front began to prepare for the long grinding war that Yamamoto had always feared. The quick victory that was supposed to bring America to the negotiating table had instead guaranteed a fight to the finish that Japan could not possibly win. In the years that followed, historians would debate the precise moment when Japan's defeat became inevitable, but the veterans who survived Midway knew the answer. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, whose dive bombers had started the destruction of the Japanese fleet, would later write that the empire died in those 6 minutes over the Pacific when American bombs found their targets. The rising sun flag might continue to fly over occupied territories for 3 more years, but the power that had hoisted it over half the Pacific was already sinking beneath the waves off Midway. The Battle of Midway's legacy extended far beyond the immediate tactical results, reshaping the entire strategic balance of the Pacific War. Japan's admirals, once confident in their ability to dictate terms to the Western powers, now found themselves fighting a defensive war against an enemy whose industrial and demographic advantages made ultimate victory impossible. The gamble that was supposed to secure Japan's Pacific Empire had instead guaranteed its destruction, as Admiral Yamamoto had privately predicted from the beginning. The attack on Pearl Harbor had awakened the sleeping giant, and at Midway, that giant finally opened its eyes to deliver the blow that would bring down the rising sun forever.